Welcome to the Burnett Breakdown, where I, Hunter Burnett, keep up with the news so that you don't have to. This week, I'm going to be talking about President Trump's arraignment in Miami, the Fed pauses rate hikes, and the Chinese economy. So I will start with Tuesday's news and kind of news spectacle of President Trump being arraigned in Miami, Florida. So arraigned is where Trump basically showed up to the Miami courthouse, pled not guilty to all 37 charges from the indictment that were released last week. If you kind of need a breakdown of the indictment from last week, then I recommend going to read my newsletter from Monday, actually, on Substack, where I break down kind of the seriousness of these allegations, and that if these allegations, in my mind, are proven true, and the evidence is presented in court, then President Trump, former President Trump, Donald Trump, should, I think, face legal consequences. And so this is kind of the formal process of him turning himself in. He got his fingerprint done and recorded, did not get a mugshot. Basically, the judge was like, well, we kind of already know what you look like. You're famous enough that we don't necessarily need a mugshot. And so no mugshot was taken, but he got his fingerprints and then that not guilty plea. Now, this is the first time that a former president has been, or I guess current president, that a former president, any president, has been indicted on federal charges. So if you remember, President Trump did something similar in New York a couple of months ago when kind of the first indictment, and that involves state charges. And that's an important difference between this indictment and the last indictment. The last indictment was New York City, and basically accusing Donald Trump of breaking state laws. Now it's being accused that he's breaking federal laws, and the federal government is now charging him in this classified documents case. So the first former president to be indicted on federal charges, Donald Trump gets to wear that crown. Moving on to on Wednesday, the Federal Reserve paused its rate hike. So the Federal Open Market Committee voted unanimously to keep the federal funds rate at the current target range of between 5 to 5.25%. This is kind of a stop from the raises that the Fed has been doing. The Fed has raised 10 consecutive times before this Wednesday pause. So this, for the time being, at least, ends the Fed's sharp rate increase campaign that essentially took rates from last February 2022, which when at that time interest rates stood at 0 to 0.25%, all the way to 5 to 5.25% in a little over a year. This is the fastest rate increase campaign that we have, I think, seen in the history of the Federal Reserve. Now, that does not necessarily mean that they are done raising rates completely. In fact, Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman, said that the pause allows them more time to, quote, assess additional information and its implications. So they're kind of taking a wait-and-see approach. They don't want to continue to raise rates this time because they want to kind of see the consequences and the effects of the rate hikes that they've already done, see if those rate hikes have tamed inflation, which is the goal, and to kind of assess what to do in the future. Powell continued, if you look at the full range of inflation data, particularly the core data, you just aren't seeing a lot of progress over the last year. So Powell alluding there to this what it could be future rate hikes, because the progress that they would like to see in taming inflation, according to Powell, just isn't there. He continued, quote, nearly all committee participants view it as likely that some further rate increases will be appropriate this year to bring inflation down to 2% over time. So even though this may be the end of the rate increase cycle, or at least continuous rate increase, it is not necessarily the end of the rate increase cycle. At least Powell is alluding to the fact that they will likely continue to raise rates, just maybe down the line. Now, I am no economist, so take pretty much everything I say about the Federal Reserve and monetary policy with a grain of salt. But I am relatively persuaded by David Bahnsen. David Bahnsen is kind of a financial advisor, wealth management advisor. His argument that the Fed should not be raising rates anymore. He essentially argues that the weight that rent and shelter is measured in the in inflation or the CPI number, that there's a lag effect. So what this does is this kind of makes the overall CPI number higher than it probably realistically is. Since if we look at kind of other sources of rent and shelter data, we see that rent and shelter costs are coming down pretty dramatically across the country. And so if we kind of take out the impact, the lag effect of the rent and shelter costs, then we kind of have a lower inflation rate than that overall CPI number. I also tend to think that the Fed is overly focused on the labor market. Jerome Powell has constantly come out and talked about how the labor market's too strong, and this kind of, I think, is a false economic idea of that jobs, people having jobs, and having wages and maybe even increased wages is bad for the economy. Obviously, you can have, if you're thinking about inflation in terms of a supply and demand issue of the overall economy, you can't have too much demand, so to speak. But what the economy, I think, really needs right now isn't for less demand, but actually more supply. We need to produce more. We need to grow the economy. We need to incentivize production, not just decrease demand, and that is essentially what higher interest rates do, is to decrease the demand side of the equation. But I don't think that is all that we have to do, primarily because when you think about inflation, it's not just kind of this supply and demand, but it's also how fast is the money cycling through the economy. How fast is it moving? When you buy something, that money will eventually wind up in a deposit in a bank in some capacity. Well, what the bank does with that money, it could sit on it. Well, if it's sitting on it, then that money isn't in the economy. So we can have all the demand in the world, but if the banks aren't then lending it out to people to go and produce more and be economically productive, then you will have this kind of sugar high, like we did during COVID, of demand, but eventually the money isn't cycling through the economy. And so what we actually need is, and I think that we're at risk of that. I think we're at risk of the money essentially not leaving the banks, okay? Because there's not the investment and not the opportunities that we need, because the economy isn't growing like it ought to. And so I think the focus that the Fed is too focused on the labor market and too focused on basically causing a recession, when I think that we can actually grow our way out of this inflation mess. Because if we increase supply, then we are going to not have to worry so much about the demand, because the supply, hopefully, is going to move faster and grow more than the demand. Finally, I wanted to bring this up because I thought this was a kind of a really important development or update on a story that I've been following for a long time, and that is what Jim Risch, which is a senator from Idaho, what he's been doing and what he just decided to do this week in the Senate. So Jim Risch is like I said, is a senator from Idaho, and he's actually the top Republican on the Foreign Relations Committee. And what he's doing is he's halting a $735 million U.S. arms sale to Hungary. Now, the reason why he's halting this is because it's in response to Hungary's refusal to approve Sweden's membership to NATO. So once Russia invaded Ukraine, both Sweden and Finland, who both have a long history of remaining neutral, a long history of not joining NATO, both applied for NATO membership. Finland, their application essentially was approved, but Sweden's was not, and it's not because you need every single member country of NATO to approve your application. And two countries are basically holding out on Sweden, and that is Turkey and that is Hungary. And they're both doing it essentially because they view Sweden as being too accepting, so to speak, of Kurd nationalists that both countries, Hungary and Turkey, think are basically classify as terrorist group. I don't really buy that argument. I think both of these countries are just ultra nationalists right now, and both of the leaders of these countries are ultra nationalists right now, so they don't want to expand NATO, when I think expanding NATO, including countries like Finland and Sweden, who both have a history of military power and Western and liberal democracies, I think that is a good thing. I think the stronger that NATO is, the more it does its job of basically pushing back against totalitarian regimes like in Russia and like in China. And so I'm happy to see Jim Risch basically saying that, okay, Hungary, if you want to do this and you want to continue to be in the thorn in the side of Sweden and not admit them to NATO, then we're not going to give you what you want, and that is this military equipment. So the sale included 24 HIMARS rocket launch batteries and more than 100 rockets and pods, along with the parts and support. And so, by the United States, I think, has every right to say, okay, you don't want to do what we want you to do, then we're not going to do what you want us to do. And so, good job, Jim Risch, on doing this and kind of putting some pressure on Hungary to go along with the Sweden's NATO application. Moving on to international news, China apparently has a base on Cuba. So last week, the Wall Street Journal reported that China and Cuba had come to a secret agreement to install a Chinese surveillance post on the island. So less than 100 miles off the Florida's coast, you are now allegedly have, according to this report, have a Chinese surveillance post, this agreement. Now, the administration came out and basically said, actually, they've had this post there for a while. This is nothing new. They've had it since at least 2019. This doesn't necessarily surprise me at all that China is working with Cuba, Cuba obviously being a communist regime, and has a long kind of hostility towards the United States and vice versa. So it doesn't surprise me at all that China would set up a listening station. But it being there is significant. The goal is to essentially have electronic communications, the capabilities of collecting the electronic communications, like things like email and phone calls across the southeastern United States, which is significant because this is a region of the United States that contains a lot of military installations. So while it's not a surprise that they're doing this, it is significant, and it comes at a very poor time for the administration. So Secretary of State Anthony Blinken is reportedly headed to Beijing this weekend. He's currently on a trip through the Middle East and reportedly will arrive in Beijing on Sunday, Father's Day, where he will likely meet with the Chinese foreign minister and even possibly President Xi Jinping. Now, Blinken was supposed to do this back in February, but that trip was delayed because of the whole Chinese spy balloon fiasco that happened at that time. It was a bad look for the administration to basically go to China and work with the Chinese regime after they just flew a spy balloon through United States airspace. So they postponed it. And again, this is a really bad look still. I've not been impressed with the way that the Biden administration has been addressing China as the top adversary, I think, of the United States. I think this is just another example of that. Obviously, the timing is what it is. The report coming out is what it is. They can't do anything about that. But I also don't think the solution is to continue to work on through diplomacy. Sometimes you have to build up strength. Sometimes you have to play hardball. And I just don't see the Biden administration doing a whole lot of that. Speaking of China, I want to talk briefly about their economy, because while the Federal Reserve is pausing rates and looking to potentially continue to increase them later this year, the Chinese central bank is actually doing the opposite. They are trimming their interest rates. And this speaks, I think, volumes to the Chinese economy. This is a topic that I've kind of continually talked about, is if we see China as the adversary, the top adversary for the of the United States, which I do. There's this belief that China is this kind of growing superpower and the United States is in decline or decay. And I actually don't think that's the case. I view China as the declining power. And this, I think, serves as another kind of justification for why I think that. Because the economy of China, this growing economy that's been growing for decades, is now not really growing. Now, they had COVID, right? And so during COVID, they shut down their entire economy, which was, dumb to begin with. But once they actually lifted those COVID restrictions, their kind of zero COVID policy, there was this belief that they were going to continue to grow. And it turns out that they did rebound, but that's starting to weaken. So retail sales and industrial production grew more slowly than economists had expected this year. Also, the property market is showing signs of continued stress, and youth unemployment hit a record high in China. Again, this is a big deal. The Chinese economy has to grow. The Chinese economy has to grow because it's entirely based off of debt. The Chinese government, the very central totalitarian regime, has basically centralized their economy and has continued this process of centralization. And I do not believe a centralized economy can flourish. I don't think it's possible to flourish. The only reason the Chinese economy has been growing for the last few decades is because they've actually decentralized it. They opened it up to the Western world. And as President Xi Jinping has begun to re-centralize the economy, it's no surprise that it has slowed down. Now, the central bank realizes this, and that is why they're trimming their interest rates in order to encourage and incentivize growth. And they can do this because inflation right now in China isn't really a thing. Not only are they lowering interest rates to kind of stimulate and growth, but they actually are issuing special treasury bonds. So again, this is a Wall Street Journal reporting that the central government of China is considering issuing special treasury bonds worth roughly 1 trillion won, equivalent to $140 billion to help fund new infrastructure and stimulate economic growth. So we see that the Chinese government itself is worried about economic growth and worried about growing the economy because they understand that if they do not grow, that they're going to be in real trouble. So this is one of my kind of, warnings to the American people is the Chinese economy was growing for a very long time. We don't have to necessarily be so worried about the Chinese economy that we begin to centralize our economy, that we begin to onshore and hike tariffs and basically enact mercantilist economic policies in order to beat the Chinese economy. I think the opposite is true. We need to liberalize trade. We need to open our markets. We need to make free trade agreements with Southeast Asian countries like Cambodia, like Vietnam. We actually don't need to hike tariffs and onshore all of our domestic industries because that is simply the government of the United States trying to pick and choose winners and losers in the economy, which I don't think they can do. I don't think the Chinese government can do it. And I think if the United States continues the economic policies that it has been pursuing for the last few decades, that will actually increase economic growth. And I think the American economy will leave China in the dust. Finally, the last story I want to talk about this week is a migrant boat collapsed and capsized in the Mediterranean Sea. So at least 79 people died and dozens more were missing off the coast of Greece after a fishing vessel carrying migrants from North Africa capsized in stormy weather. Authorities said that 104 people had been rescued so far, and the United Nations International Organization for Migration said initial reports suggested that there might have been as many as 400 people aboard this vessel. A reason why I point this story out, number one, it's tragic, but number two, I think what it shows us is that the United States is not the only country struggling with immigration right now. In fact, the number of migrants crossing the Mediterranean from North Africa to Europe is at its highest level since 2015-2016. This was when, if you'll remember, is after as the civil war in Syria was kind of continuing to increase in its viciousness, and more than a million Syrians and other migrants in 2015 and 16 reached Europe, mostly via Greece. So we're at the same levels that we were during the Syrian civil war in seeing in the migration from North Africa to Europe. So the United States is not the only country right now in the Western world dealing with immigration issues. Immigration is it has been issues for countries, for nations, going as far back as you can in world history. What people do when they have the opportunity in other countries to have jobs, to find jobs, to make a better life for themselves, they tend to take that chance. And they leave where they're from and they go and try to find a better and make a better life. And so the United States, though their immigration system is a mess, Europe is experiencing the same thing. And that should actually, I think, encourage the United States and encourage the Western world. The Western world is still the best place to be. The United States gets more immigrants than any other country in the world, legal and illegal, not because they are out to destroy the country. That's not why immigrants come, even illegal immigrants. That's not why they come. They're coming because in the Western world, and in the United States in particular, it's worth the risk. It's worth it because the economic opportunities, the freedoms that we have here, do not compare, are incomparable to the rest of the world. They want to be here. And so I think part of the discussion that we and the European Union have to have with immigration is, number one, making sure that we know who is coming in and out of our country, right? So we have to secure the border. But we can't just build a wall and keep everybody out, especially not with birth rates in the Western world declining as they are. Economically speaking, what we need to do is encourage immigration. Legal immigration, yes, but nonetheless, immigration. Because as birth rates decline in the Western world, we're going to need workers. If we want our economy to continue to grow, we're going to need more and more workers to fill the jobs that will be created with economic growth. So, how do we do that if birth rates are declining? Immigration. And so I think with this migrant boat capsizing, it should be an opportunity for the European Union, yes, but also for the United States to look in the mirror and say, what are we doing about immigration? What ought we do about immigration? See, it doesn't matter the president of the United States. Republican, Democrat, Trump, Biden, the immigration system in the United States is a mess. And it's a mess because Congress refuses to act. Because it's easier to rant and rave about the immigration system, whether it's too harsh or too open, than it is to actually fix and address the issue. So Congress needs to act, needs to come up with a comprehensive immigration bill, a reform of the immigration system that both secures the border so that we know who is coming in and out, but also makes it easy for immigrants to come to become citizens, contributing members to the society, and to accept them with open arms. So with that is it for the Burnett Breakdown this week. Please like, subscribe, share, do whatever you can to make this podcast go far and wide, and I will see you again next week.